There are secrets that kill you inside, and what I discovered inside that pocket watch changed my life forever. Good morning, my dear viewers. My name is Margaret, I'm 79 years old, and today I'm going to share a story I've kept in my heart for decades. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you watching now to please leave a like on this video, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel, and turn on notifications to receive more stories like this one. Also, I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from today. It's always a pleasure to know my stories reach people from so many different places. I'm going to tell you about the pocket watch my husband hid every night before bed and the terrible secret it kept. A story of betrayal and lies, but also of resilience and strength. I married Richard in 1963. I was only 17 years old, and he was 28. In those days, respectable girls married young and followed their parents' wishes. My family was humble. My father worked in the fields, and my mother took care of the house and 7 children. I was the middle child. Richard came from a slightly better-off family. He worked as an accountant at the only bank in our small town, Millfield, in rural Kentucky. He was a handsome man, always well-dressed, soft-spoken with an easy smile. Everyone respected him for his intelligence and polite manner. We met at a church fair. He asked me to dance, and 3 months later, we were engaged. My parents were happy about the marriage, an older man with a steady job who was respected in town. I was happy too. I thought I had found my Prince Charming, like in the stories my grandmother told me when I was little. Our wedding was simple but beautiful. We moved into a small but cozy house near the center of town. From the very first day, I noticed something peculiar about Richard. He always carried a silver pocket watch with copper details. It was old but well preserved. According to him, it was the only memento he had from his father, who had died in the war. The watch was beautiful, really, but there was something about the way he handled it that caught my attention. Every night before bed, he would take it out of his vest pocket, look at it for a few moments with an expression I could never decipher, a mixture of reverence and concern, and store it in a small carved wooden box that he locked with a little key. This key he always carried on a thin chain around his neck. He never took it off, not even to bathe. In the beginning of our marriage, I asked a few times about the watch. Why was it so important? Why did it need to be locked away? Why was the key always around his neck? But he always changed the subject. It's just a family heirloom, Margaret. Nothing you need to worry about. And I, raised not to question too much, respected his silence. In the first years, we were happy, at least in the way I understood happiness back then. Children came quickly. Anthony was born in our first year of marriage. Claire came 2 years later, and Samuel completed our family in 1967. Richard was a good provider. We never lacked food on the table or clothes to wear. On Sundays, we all went to church together. Afterward, we would have lunch at my mother's house or his sister's. We were what you might call an exemplary family in those times. Richard was a good father, in his own way. He didn't play much with the children, but he always brought small presents when he came home from work, asked about school, and sometimes on weekends, he would take Anthony fishing in the river that ran through town. With the girls, he was more reserved, but never lacked affection. He was a man of his time. He thought his main function was to provide for the family, and that raising the children was more my responsibility. I took care of the house and the children, made all the meals, washed and ironed clothes, tended the vegetable garden in the back, and still found time to do embroidery work that I sold to supplement our income. It was a simple but decent life. I couldn't complain. Many women I knew had husbands who drank away their salaries or who were violent. Richard never hit me, never yelled at me in front of others. Our problems, when they existed, stayed within the 4 walls of our home. But as time passed, I began to notice changes in Richard. Around 1968, he was promoted to bank manager. It was an important position for a small town like ours. Suddenly, our standard of living improved. We moved to a larger house with a nice yard where the children could play. We bought our first radio. Richard began to dress even better. He had suits made in the city, and along with this improvement in our lives came the trips. At first, it was once a month. Richard said he needed to go to the city for meetings at the bank's headquarters. It was reasonable for his position, so I didn't question it. But gradually, these trips became more frequent. Once a month became twice, then almost every week. He said they were important meetings, training sessions, conferences. I believed him, of course. Why would I doubt my husband? It was during this time that he began to grow more distant, more closed off. Sometimes he would spend hours in silence, reading the newspaper or simply staring into space with a glass of cognac in his hand. The children missed their father, especially on weekends, when he used to be present, but now frequently said he needed to take care of work matters. I tried to fill that absence, telling stories, inventing games, making cakes and sweets they liked. I tried to be both mother and father without ever complaining in front of them about their father's absence. Daddy works very hard to give us a good life, I would say. And I believed it. I truly believed it. Then the strange things began. Phone calls to our house where the person would hang up when I answered. At first, I thought they were wrong numbers, but it happened with suspicious frequency. And there were the telegrams. Richard would receive them, read them quickly, and burn them immediately. When I asked, he said they were confidential bank matters that he couldn't keep records of for security reasons. I was beginning to feel that something was wrong, but I didn't know exactly what. In those days, it wasn't common to suspect your husband or question him directly. A wife was supposed to be the pillar of the home, the one who keeps everything in order, who turns a blind eye to small faults in the name of family harmony. At least, that's what my mother always taught me. There was one night, however, that changed everything. It was January 1970, a hot summer Friday. The children were already asleep, and I was waiting for Richard for dinner. He had promised to come home early since we were all going to visit my sister, who lived in the neighboring town the next day. I waited until 9, then until 10. The fried chicken and mashed potatoes I had made, his favorite dish, were already cold on the table. Finally, near midnight, I heard the car arriving. Richard stumbled through the door, so drunk he could barely stand. In all our years of marriage, I had never seen him in that state. He always drank socially, a glass of wine at dinner or an occasional cognac, but never to the point of losing control. I ran to help him inside, fearing the neighbors might see him in that state, which would be cause for shame for a respectable family like ours. "Are you okay, Richard?" "What happened?" I asked worriedly as I helped him reach the bedroom. Nothing happened," he muttered, his words slurring. "Just a celebration at the bank, a colleague's promotion." I knew it was a lie. The scent of women's perfume mixed with alcohol was obvious, but I swallowed the lump in my throat and continued to help him undress for bed. That's when it happened. As I tried to remove his jacket, he tripped and fell heavily onto the bedroom floor. I tried to lift him, but he was too heavy for me. As he struggled, trying to get up on his own, I saw something I had never seen before. The chain that held the key to the watch box around his neck broke with the impact, and the key rolled under the dresser. I finally managed to help him onto the bed. Within minutes, Richard was snoring deeply. I stood there, looking at him with a whirlwind of thoughts. Then my eyes went to the floor, to the spot where the key had fallen. I could have left the key where it was until the next day. I could have forgotten about it, as I had done with so many other things all these years. But 7 years of small doubts, unanswered questions, and unexplained absences had created a weight in my chest that I could no longer ignore. With trembling hands, I knelt down and, feeling under the dresser, found the key. It was small, golden, with an intricate design at the tip. The chain that held it had broken in two. I stood looking at it in the palm of my hand, feeling its weight, which seemed much heavier than it should be for such a small object. I looked at Richard, deeply asleep on the bed. I knew he wouldn't wake up any time soon, not in the state he was in. Slowly, I went to the dresser where the carved wooden box that held the watch was kept. The box was beautiful, made of mahogany, with delicate carvings of flowers and birds. I had never opened it before. In all these years of marriage, I had respected my husband's private space, his small reservations. But that night, something drove me to discover what was so special about that watch that it needed to be kept under lock and key. With my heart pounding, I inserted the key into the small lock. It turned smoothly, and the lid opened with a soft click. Inside, on red velvet already worn by time, was the watch. I picked it up carefully. It was heavier than it looked, the cold metal against my skin. The front had a raised design, a sort of crest or symbol that I didn't recognize. I opened the front cover of the watch. The dial was white enamel, with Roman numerals and delicate blue steel hands. It seemed to work perfectly, marking the correct time. I turned it in my hands, examining every detail, trying to understand what was so special about it. That's when I noticed something strange on the back, a small button almost imperceptible, hidden near the hinge. I pressed it gently, and to my surprise, the back cover opened, revealing a secret compartment. My heart almost stopped when I saw what was inside. Carefully hidden in that small space was a tiny photograph, the size of a fingernail, cut in an oval shape to fit perfectly in the compartment. It showed a young and beautiful woman with dark hair and a luminous smile, holding a small child, a boy of no more than a year. Even though small, the image was clear enough for me to realize that I didn't know these people. I had never seen that woman or child before. With trembling fingers, I removed the photograph from the compartment and turned it over. On the back, written in tiny, almost microscopic handwriting, I read the words that would change my life. Helen and Edward, 1967, New York. 1967, the year our youngest son, Samuel, was born. While I was at home, caring for 3 small children, where was Richard? With whom? Who were that woman and that child? Why did he keep that photograph with such care and secrecy? My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped the watch. Besides the photograph, there was also a small piece of paper folded several times. I unfolded it carefully so as not to tear it, as it seemed very fragile. It was a very small receipt, but still legible. A rent receipt for an apartment on West 75th Street in New York City, in Richard's name, dated the previous month. An address I was completely unaware of. After examining these items, I went back to search the secret compartment of the watch and found another surprise. Hidden under the watch mechanism was a very small key, different from the one that opened the box. It was golden, with a simpler design, and obviously didn't belong to any lock in our house. That night, my world fell apart. The puzzle pieces began to fit together in my mind. The frequent trips, the mysterious phone calls, the burned telegrams, all the small things I had ignored for years, trying to be a good wife, were now screaming the truth in my face. Carefully, I put the photograph and receipt back in the secret compartment of the watch. I closed the back cover, then the front, returned the watch to the box, and locked it. But the small golden key that I found inside the secret compartment, that I kept for myself, I hid it in my sewing box among the spools of thread. As for the key to the box, the one that Richard always carried around his neck, I placed it exactly where it had fallen, near the dresser. He needed to believe that the key had simply come loose during the fall and that nothing else had happened. I spent the rest of that night awake, sitting in the bedroom chair, looking at the man who slept in our bed. A stranger, a man I thought I knew for 7 years, but who now seemed a complete unknown. The father of my children, my husband, a man who, it seemed, led a double life. What would I do now? How would I confront Richard? And what would this mean for me, for our children? So many questions without answers, so many fears and uncertainties. I knew only one thing for certain. Nothing would be the same. When the sun began to come through the cracks in the curtains, I was still sitting in that chair, my eyes burning from so much silent crying. Richard woke up with a hangover written all over his face. I pretended to be dozing, but I observed him out of the corner of my eye as he frantically searched for the key he always carried. I saw the relief in his face when he found it on the floor, exactly where I had left it. With trembling hands, he put it back on the broken chain and tied it around his neck again. "Margaret, wake up. It's not good to sleep in that chair," he said, his voice hoarse. I pretended to wake up slowly. "You came home very late last night," I commented, trying to keep my voice neutral. "We were supposed to visit my sister today." "It won't be possible," he replied, massaging his temples. "I need to take care of some problems at the bank. Emergency." Another lie. How many had there been? I nodded silently and went to prepare coffee. The children soon woke up, disappointed about the canceled trip. I promised to take them to the river in the afternoon to make up for it. Richard drank his coffee quickly and left, barely saying goodbye. I watched him from the kitchen window as he got into the car. Was he really going to the bank on a Saturday? Or was he hitting the road to New York, to the address on the receipt, to Helen and Edward? As soon as the car disappeared around the corner, I put my plan into action. I sent the children to play in the yard and went straight to Richard's office in the house, a small room where he kept bank documents and did some accounting on weekends. Normally, I would never enter there without being called. It was his space, and in our house, spaces were well defined. The office was Richard's territory, just as the kitchen was my domain. But now all the rules had changed. The office was simple: a dark wood desk, 2 chairs, a bookshelf with accounting books, and a small typewriter. On the wall, a portrait of us from our wedding day, and a bank calendar. I sat in his chair and began to open the desk drawers. The first 2 contained what I expected: bank papers, pens, pencils, some receipts. The third was locked. I tried to force it, but without success. That's when I remembered the small golden key I had found in the watch. With my heart racing, I retrieved the key from my sewing box and returned to the office. I inserted it into the lock of the drawer. It fit perfectly. As I turned the key, the drawer opened with a soft click. Inside was a brown leather folder. I opened it carefully, like someone defusing a bomb. The contents confirmed my worst fears. First, a birth certificate. The official paper with the seal of the United States left no doubt. Edward Jennings Parker, born on April 15, 1967, at St. Mary's Hospital, New York City. Father, Richard Parker. Mother, Helen Jennings. April 15, 1967. I remembered that date well. Richard had traveled to a week-long banking conference. He returned with gifts for all of us. For me, he brought a pearl necklace that I still wear on special occasions. Now I knew the real reason for the trip: the birth of his other son. There were more documents in the folder: bank statements from an account in Helen Jennings' name, with regular monthly deposits. The amount was considerable, almost the same as what Richard allocated for our monthly expenses. I also found a lease for the apartment in New York, larger photos of Helen and Edward, and some letters. With trembling hands, I opened the most recent letter, dated 2 weeks earlier. The delicate handwriting on blue-scented paper already revealed it was from a woman. "Dear Richard, Edward asks every day when you will return. His birthday is approaching, and he hopes that this time you can stay with us longer. I miss you terribly. These 2 weeks without you seem like an eternity. I understand your commitments, but it's getting increasingly difficult to explain your absences to our son. He is young, but already beginning to notice that his father is different from the fathers of his friends who are always present. The doctor said his cold has improved. Don't worry. We will be waiting for you on Friday, as agreed. With all my love, Helen." Each word was like a needle in my heart. Our son. I miss you. With all my love. Phrases that were once said to me, now repeated to another woman. I continued examining the folder and found something even more devastating. A family portrait. Helen, Edward, and Richard, all 3 smiling in front of a birthday cake with 2 candles. Richard held the boy in his lap with the same proud expression with which he had held our children. The photo was dated: Edward's birthday, April 15, 1969. Exactly at the same time that Richard had said he needed to travel to Boston for an extensive training at the bank. He was gone for 10 days. He returned with stories about colleagues, the hotel, the classes, all lies. As I turned the pages of that folder, discovering more and more evidence of the betrayal, a deaf rage began to grow inside me. It wasn't just an adventure, a passing affair. It was an entire parallel life, built with the same deliberation with which one builds a house, brick by brick. How long had it lasted? At least since 1966, when Helen got pregnant. More than 3 years of elaborate lies, of comings and goings, of invented stories. I could have screamed, cried, broken things, but at that moment, a strange calm came over me. It was as if I were watching the scene from the outside, a spectator of my own life. I put all the documents back in the folder, except for a copy of Edward's birth certificate, which I kept as proof. I closed the drawer and locked it. I returned the key to my sewing box. I spent the rest of the day like an automaton. I washed clothes, prepared lunch, took the children to the river as I had promised. I did all the tasks I always did, but my mind was far away, processing the new reality I had discovered. The children noticed my distraction, but attributed it to tiredness. "Mommy is tired today," I would say, forcing a smile. At night, I bathed the children, told them stories to help them sleep, and set the table for dinner. Richard arrived at 9, tired, as he always claimed to be after a day of work at the bank. We ate in silence, with only the radio playing softly in the background. After dinner, when the children were already asleep, I prepared coffee and placed Edward's birth certificate on the living room table. "We need to talk, Richard." He raised his eyes from the newspaper he pretended to read, and his gaze fell on the document on the table. The recognition was immediate. His face paled. For a moment, I thought he might faint. I had never seen a man lose color so quickly. Where did you find this?" he finally stammered. "That doesn't matter," I replied, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "What matters is that I know everything. Helen, Edward, the apartment in New York, the years of lies." He remained silent for a time that seemed eternal. Then, as if a dam had broken, he began to talk. The words came tumbling out, a confession that seemed to have been choking him for years. He met Helen in 1966 during a real work trip to New York. She was a secretary at the regional bank office. They began an affair. He promised to leave his wife. The usual story. When Helen got pregnant, Richard panicked. He couldn't abandon the children he already had. He couldn't bear the scandal it would cause in our small town. But he also couldn't abandon Helen, pregnant with his child. So he made what he considered the most humane decision: maintain both families. He rented an apartment for Helen in New York, opened an account to support them, and began to divide his time between us, inventing more and more work trips and commitments. "I love you both," he said, as if that justified everything. "Helen and you and the children, I couldn't choose. I couldn't abandon either of you." I looked at him, this man who for years I thought I knew. How was it possible that he believed what he was doing was acceptable? How could he speak of love while building a life based on lies? "Love isn't like that, Richard," I finally said. "Love is respect, honesty. What you did has nothing to do with love. It's pure selfishness." He tried to justify himself further. He talked about how things simply happened, how he found himself entangled in a situation he didn't know how to resolve. He talked about his feelings for me, for our children, for Helen, for Edward, about how he lived divided, tormented by guilt, but unable to give up either of his families. I listened to everything in silence, letting him empty himself of excuses. When he finally fell silent, exhausted, I had already made my decision. Something inside me had broken forever with the discovery of the betrayal. But at the same time, a new strength had been born from the ruins. A determination that I didn't know I had. "You need to choose, Richard," I said, with a calmness that surprised us both. "Not tomorrow, not next week, now. Either you stay with us, me and your legitimate children, your wife before God and society, or you leave forever to live with your other family." He looked at me astonished, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. For years, I had been the understanding wife who accepted his explanations without questioning, who turned a blind eye to his absences and strange behavior. Now, for the first time, I was taking a stand, establishing a boundary. "Margaret, it's not that simple," he began. "I need time. I need to organize things. I can't simply abandon Helen and Edward from one moment to the next." "The choice is now, Richard," I repeated, my voice firmer than ever. "If you walk out that door to go to them, don't come back. I will find a way to raise our children alone." He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to assess whether I was serious. Then, without saying anything more, he slowly got up and went upstairs to the bedroom. I heard him opening and closing drawers, the sound of a suitcase being dragged. I remained seated in the living room, motionless, listening to his movements on the floor above. A part of me still hoped he would change his mind, that he would choose to stay, that he would beg for forgiveness on his knees. But another part, perhaps the more lucid one, already knew what his choice would be. Half an hour later, he came down with a small suitcase. He stopped in front of me, his eyes avoiding mine. "I'll get a few things from the office," he said, almost in a whisper. I nodded silently. I watched as he entered the office and came out minutes later. In his hand, besides the suitcase, he now carried the brown leather folder and the wooden box with the watch. "Tell the children that I... He tried, but the words seemed to escape him. "I will tell them whatever is best for them," I replied. "You can leave that to me." He nodded, seeming relieved that I would take on this responsibility too. Typical. Even at the end, he was still trying to escape the consequences of his actions. "I'll send money every month," he promised. "You won't be in need." "Take care of your other family," I replied. "We will find a way." With one last hesitant look, he walked to the door. His hand on the doorknob paused as if he were going to say something else. But what more was there to say? He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. I heard the car engine start, the sound diminishing as he drove away. And at that moment, I knew that a phase of my life had ended. I, who had always defined myself as a wife and mother, was now an abandoned woman with 3 small children to raise in a society that did not look kindly upon separated women. But instead of despair, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, the weight of living a lie, of sharing a bed and a life with a man who wasn't who he claimed to be. I slowly climbed the stairs and went to look at my sleeping children. Anthony, 6 years old, so similar to his father in gestures and stubbornness, Claire, 4, with my eyes and calm temperament, and Samuel, only 3, still a baby in my eyes. They slept peacefully, unaware that their lives had changed forever that night. Promising myself that I would do everything to protect them, to compensate for their father's absence, to give them a dignified life, I lay down in my bed, now mine alone. And for the first time in a long time, I cried without fear of being heard. I cried for the marriage I thought I had, for the broken promises, for the family that fell apart, but I also cried with relief for the truth finally revealed, for the liberation from a life of lies. That night, as tears washed my soul, I still didn't know what the future held. I didn't know about the challenges I would face as a single woman in a small town in the 1970s. I didn't know about the financial difficulties, the prejudice, the closed doors, but I also didn't know about the strength I would discover in myself, the capacity for reinvention, the love that would sustain me through my children. What I knew at that moment was that the truth, however painful it might be, was always preferable to the sweetest of lies, and that the watch that Richard so protected, with its secret compartment guarding the proof of his betrayal, had ironically marked the end of one time in my life and the beginning of another. A time of challenges, but also of discoveries. A time that, looking back now at 79 years of age, I can say was the beginning of my true life. The morning after Richard left, I woke up with swollen eyes and a dry throat. For an instant, still drowsy, I reached out to his side of the bed. It was empty, cold. Reality hit me like a bucket of ice water. I was alone. I heard Claire's light footsteps in the hallway. Soon she would come into the room, as she did every morning, asking for a hug, telling her childish dreams. How would I explain her father's absence? What words would I use to not hurt her innocent heart? "Mommy, where's Daddy?" was the first question when she came in, rubbing her sleepy little eyes. "Daddy had to travel for work, sweetie," I replied, hugging her. A very important trip. It wasn't exactly a lie. It was a simplified truth, adapted to protect a 4-year-old child from the weight of a reality that even I couldn't fully process. In the days that followed, I used variations of the same story for all three. Daddy is working far away. Daddy sent a kiss. Daddy thinks about you every day. The questions were constant at first. Then they decreased. Children have an impressive ability to adapt to changes, much more than we adults. A week after Richard's departure, I received a visit from Mr. Thompson, the general manager of the bank, a serious man with small glasses and a gray mustache. We sat in the living room, the children playing in the yard. "Mrs. Parker, I've come to inform you that your husband has resigned from the bank," he said after the formal greetings. He sent a letter of resignation, citing personal reasons. I nodded in silence. It didn't surprise me. Richard probably needed an excuse to establish himself permanently in New York with his other family. "The bank would like to offer a severance payment," continued Mr. Thompson, handing me an envelope, "considering Mr. Parker's years of service." I opened the envelope. The amount was insignificant. It would barely cover 3 months of basic expenses. I noticed the embarrassment on Mr. Thompson's face. He probably knew or suspected the real situation. "We appreciate your discretion in this matter, Mrs. Parker," he added, getting up to leave. "The bank values its reputation in the community." I understood the message between the lines. The bank wanted to avoid scandals, and I should do the same. That same afternoon, the whispers in the neighborhood began. The news that Richard had left the bank spread quickly, as only happens in small towns. Mrs. Wilson, my neighbor on the left, came to borrow sugar, a classic excuse to gossip. "I heard Richard doesn't work at the bank anymore," she commented, feigning disinterest. "Did he find something better in the city?" "Yes, an opportunity he couldn't refuse," I replied with a polite but firm smile. I told the same story to everyone who came to ask in the following weeks. An unmissable opportunity. "We're organizing to move too." The children are excited about the news, forced smiles, vague explanations, a necessary charade to preserve my dignity and that of my children. But the reality inside the house was very different. The severance money ran out quickly. I had no work experience. I had married very young, going directly from my parents' house to Richard's. I had never needed to work outside the home, never developed skills that the market valued. The promised monthly money from Richard never came. I later discovered he had requested a transfer to a foreign branch of the bank. Uruguay, they said, a convenient way to escape his responsibilities in the United States. I began to sell things from the house. First, the valuable items, the radio, the Singer sewing machine that Richard had given me as a present on our 3rd wedding anniversary, some jewelry I had inherited from my grandmother. Then, decorative pieces, furniture that wasn't essential. Each sale was like tearing off a piece of myself, of the life I had built, of the memories I had collected. My sister Cecilia, who lived in the neighboring town, was my greatest support during this period. Married to a successful merchant, she had a comfortable financial situation. She offered for us to move into her house until I could establish myself. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone, Cecilia." I refused at first. "Family is not a burden, Margaret," she replied with that characteristic firmness of hers. "And these children need a safe roof over their heads." I ended up giving in. In March 1970, 2 months after Richard's departure, we left our house. I sold most of the furniture. I kept only some personal mementos and clothes. The hardest part was explaining it to the children. "But when Daddy comes back, where will he live?" asked Anthony, the oldest. already showing the sharp perception he always had. "Daddy knows where to find us, dear," I replied, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Don't worry about that now." Cecilia's house was large and comfortable, with a beautiful orchard in the back where the children loved to play. My brother-in-law, Thomas, was a generous man who never made us feel like intruders. Even so, I knew this was a temporary solution. I needed to regain my independence for myself and my children. I began to look for work. That's when I realized how hostile the world was to a single woman in the 1970s, especially one without specific training. The few jobs available for women, secretaries, receptionists, saleswomen, required youth, impeccable appearance, and, mainly, no family commitments that could interfere with work. 3 young children? You'll be absent a lot when they get sick, the owner of a fabric store told me frankly, rejecting my application. I returned to Cecilia's house that day, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. The children were already asleep when I arrived. I sat on the back porch, looking at the starry sky, and cried silently. "God, give me a light," I whispered to the night. "Show me a path." That's when I remembered Mrs. Mitchell, a lady for whom I occasionally did embroidery work in the days when I was married. She had a small children's clothing store in the town where we now lived. The next day, I went to see her. Mrs. Mitchell was a practical woman, of few words and penetrating gaze. She listened to my summarized story. I omitted the part about the betrayal, saying only that Richard had left us, and examined the embroidery I had brought as a sample of my work. "Your stitches are firm. The finishes are impeccable," she commented. "I can use your talent, but I can't pay much." "Anything is better than nothing, Mrs. Mitchell," I replied, feeling a small flame of hope ignite. We began a simple arrangement. She provided the cut fabrics and the patterns. I took them home and embroidered details on the clothes, flowers, animals, letters. The payment was per piece delivered. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I worked mainly at night after the children were asleep. Sitting at the kitchen table, under the yellowish light of the lamp, my fingers moved nimbly through the fabric, creating small works of art. There was something therapeutic about that work. Each stitch was as if I were rebuilding not just a piece of clothing, but my own life. Over time, my clientele grew. Other shopkeepers began to seek me out. Then came private orders, baby layettes, tablecloths for special occasions, details on party dresses. Cecilia helped me organize a small atelier in the guest room of her house, with a proper table for cutting and sewing, better lighting, a cabinet to store materials. The children adapted well to the new life. Anthony and Claire attended the local school. Samuel, still young, stayed at home with me. He was a sweet boy who loved to draw and entertained himself easily with paper and pencil while I worked. The months passed, and with them, the pain of Richard's betrayal transformed into something different. Not exactly forgiveness, but a kind of resigned acceptance. Life went on, and I didn't have time to keep dwelling on the past. There were bills to pay, children to feed, a future to build. It was in January 1971, exactly 1 year after Richard's departure, that I received the visit that would change the course of my life again. A man in a dark suit, introducing himself as a lawyer, delivered me a telegram. The telegram, brief and formal, informed of Richard's death in a car accident in New York City. He was with Helen, who also did not survive. The message also mentioned that the couple's son, Edward, was under the care of his maternal grandparents. I was paralyzed for a moment, the paper trembling in my hands. Richard dead. The man who was my husband for 7 years, the father of my children, no longer existed. There were no immediate tears. The news was too surreal to provoke an instant reaction. "Are you okay, ma'am?" asked the lawyer, noticing my paleness. "Yes, just surprised," I replied, regaining my composure. "Are there details about the accident?" "As far as I know, the car Mr. Parker was driving collided with a truck on the interstate. Instant death for both occupants." I nodded, thanked the man for the information, and closed the door. I leaned against it, weak legs, racing heart. How would I tell the children? What words would I use to explain that the father they expected to see again someday would never return? I decided to wait until they came home from school. I needed that time to organize my thoughts, to find the least traumatic way to break the news. When I finally told them, each one's reaction was unique, reflecting their personalities. Anthony, always the most rational, asked practical questions. How did it happen? Where would the funeral be? Claire cried copiously, clinging to my neck. Samuel, still too young to fully understand the concept of death, was confused, repeatedly asking when Daddy would return. That night, after everyone was asleep, I finally allowed myself to feel the impact of the news. I didn't cry for the man Richard turned out to be, but for what I thought he was, for the father my children lost, for the family we could have been if the choices had been different. In the following weeks, more revelations came. Another lawyer, representing the bank where Richard had worked, brought information that completed the puzzle of his secret life. Richard didn't just have a second family. He also had a network of debts and fraudulent financial schemes. He diverted money from the bank to maintain his double standard of living and bet on horse races, trying to recover what he borrowed. When he was discovered, he fled to New York, where he already maintained the residence with Helen. The bank had hushed up the case to avoid scandal, but now, with his death, some information was coming to light. There was no inheritance, only debts. The house, which was once ours, had already been sold to cover part of the embezzlement from the bank. The car in which he died was being financed. The apartment in New York was rented. Helen's family also didn't know about our existence and was as shocked as I was by the discovery. Richard had told them he was a widower, with children who lived with their grandmother in Kentucky. More lies, more lives manipulated by the same man. Amidst this turmoil, I received an unexpected correspondence, a package sent from New York containing the wooden box with the pocket watch that Richard so prized, accompanied by a letter written by him. The letter, dated a few days before the accident, was a confession and a request for forgiveness. Richard admitted his mistakes. He spoke of the guilt that gnawed at him, the impossibility of continuing to live in the lie. He said the watch, the only true inheritance from his father, should stay with our family, where it should have always been. I read and reread that letter several times in the days that followed. I didn't find in it the absolution that Richard probably sought in writing it, but I found a certain closure to that chapter of my life, like a door that finally closes, allowing others to open. And indeed, other doors opened. With the news of Richard's death, my social status subtly changed. I was no longer the abandoned wife, an ambiguous and uncomfortable figure for the conservative society of the time. Now I was the respectable widow, the brave mother raising her children alone after the tragic loss of her husband. This new status brought me more clients, more opportunities. My small embroidery and sewing business began to prosper. In mid-1971, I rented a small house in the same town, near Cecilia's. It was modest, but ours, a space to start over, to build new memories. The 1970s were a time of much work and many small but significant achievements. In 1974, I managed to rent a commercial space on the main street of town, where I opened my own sewing atelier. At first, it was just me. Then I hired 2 assistants. We specialized in children's clothes and baby layettes, products that were always in demand. The children grew, each developing their unique personality. Anthony, serious and studious like his father, but with a sense of responsibility and honesty that clearly came from another source. Claire, sensitive and artistic, had inherited my talent for manual work and helped me in the atelier after school. Samuel, the youngest, was curious and inventive, always taking things apart to see how they worked. In 1977, when the atelier had already transformed into a successful small store, I received another correspondence that shook the foundations of our family. A letter from Edward, Richard's son with Helen, now 10 years old. He wrote with a still childish but well-articulated handwriting, saying he knew about our existence, that he would like to meet his half-siblings, that he bore no grudge. I showed the letter to my children, now teenagers and young adults, leaving the decision in their hands. After long conversations, we decided to invite Edward to visit us during school vacation. The meeting was emotional and strange at the same time. Edward was the spitting image of Richard. The same eyes, the same smile, the same gestures. Seeing in him the man I once loved, now through the prism of years and acquired wisdom, was a surreal experience. But Edward had something that Richard never had, a genuine transparency, an honesty that came from his eyes, not just his words. Raised by his maternal grandparents, simple and honest people, he had become an admirable young man, despite the circumstances of his birth and the early loss of his parents. That visit was the first of many over the years. Edward became part of our family, an unexpected link with a past we could have chosen to forget, but by embracing it, brought us a form of healing we never imagined possible. And as for the watch, I kept it not as a reminder of the man who betrayed me, but as a symbol of my own strength. That object that held such a painful secret was what made me find within myself a courage I didn't know I had. Years later, when my children were already adults and I had retired, leaving the store in the care of Claire and Samuel, I discovered that the watch had considerable historical value. It was indeed an antique piece, manufactured in the 19th century, originally belonging to a European aristocrat. Richard hadn't lied about that. It really was a family heirloom. I offered it to Edward, thinking it fair that he should also have a memento of his father. But he refused, saying that the watch was exactly where it should be, with me, the woman who had the courage to face the truth and rebuild her life from the pieces left by the lie. Today, looking back at the frightened young woman I once was, discovering a secret kept in a pocket watch, I feel a mixture of compassion and admiration. Compassion for the pain I faced, admiration for the strength I discovered I had. Life teaches us in strange, sometimes cruel ways. But if we are open to learning, each lesson, however painful, brings with it a seed of growth. You know, my dear viewers, life has these surprises. When we think we have gone through everything, that we know all the curves of the path, it comes and shows us that there is still much to discover, much to live. The 1980s arrived, bringing winds of change to our family. My small sewing atelier had transformed into a respected store in town. Margaret's Creations was no longer just a survival business, but a thriving enterprise that filled me with pride. We had 6 seamstresses working full-time, 2 saleswomen, and an accountant. Just imagine me, who barely knew how to do the household accounts when Richard left, now managing a team. Our specialty continued to be children's clothes and baby layettes, but we had expanded to party dresses and, my greatest pride, wedding dresses. The first wedding dress I made was for the mayor's daughter in 1982. I remember spending sleepless nights embroidering tiny pearls on the bodice, adjusting every inch of the satin skirt. When I saw her walking to the altar, radiant in that creation that came from my hands, I felt an indescribable emotion. It was more than a dress. It was a dream materialized in fabric and thread. From then on, I became the most sought-after dressmaker for brides throughout the region. Young women came from neighboring towns to order their dresses, often bringing their mothers, who had also been my clients when they were children. This continuity, this connection between generations through my work, was something that deeply moved me. At this same time, my children were already following their own paths. Anthony, my firstborn, always studious and determined, graduated in civil engineering from the University of Kentucky in 1981. It was the proudest day of my life until then. Me, sitting in the audience at the graduation ceremony, seeing my son receive his diploma, knowing about every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every bill juggled to pay for his studies. "This achievement is yours, Mom," he told me, handing me the diploma right after the ceremony. "It was you who built the foundations that allowed me to reach here." I cried in his arms, thinking of the long road since that night in 1970, when I found myself alone with 3 small children and without prospects. Who would have thought that desperate woman would not only survive, but give her son the conditions to become an engineer? Claire, my middle child, chose a different path. She always had a natural talent for business, much more than me. While I was good at creation and production, she had a gift for numbers, strategies, market trends. After finishing high school, she refused the opportunity to go to college, preferring to work directly with me at the store. "Mom, what I learn here with you in practice, no university can teach me," she argued when I tried to convince her to study business administration. And she was right. Under her management, the store prospered even more. It was her idea to expand to the state capital, opening a branch in Louisville in 1983. This expansion was frightening and exciting at the same time. A store in the capital meant more visibility, more clients, but also more responsibilities, more risks. I remember spending sleepless nights, worried about financing debts, hiring new employees, the logistics of managing two establishments miles apart. Claire took over the management of the new store, moving to Louisville at 23. What courage my girl had. At that age, I was already married with a child, living in my husband's shadow. She, on the other hand, rented an apartment alone, hired a team, established partnerships with suppliers. When I saw her cutting the ribbon at the inauguration of Margaret's Creations boutique, I felt a mixture of maternal pride and professional admiration. Samuel, my youngest, was always the most restless of the three. From an early age, he demonstrated an insatiable curiosity, a desire to understand how things worked. He disassembled clocks, radios, any equipment that fell into his hands, not always managing to reassemble them, to my despair. In adolescence, he discovered a fascination with computers, these machines that were beginning to become more common in the early 1980s. In 1984, at 17, he came to me with an idea that seemed crazy at the time. "Mom, we need to computerize the store." I was terrified by the cost and complexity of it. Computers were expensive, complex equipment, something for large companies, not for a small clothing store in rural Kentucky. But Samuel had that gleam in his eyes, that unshakable conviction that reminded me so much of his father at Richard's best. "Trust me," he asked. "It will revolutionize how we manage the business." I took a deep breath and trusted him. We invested all our savings in buying an IBM computer, a huge machine that occupied half the back room of the store. Samuel spent weeks learning to use it, creating programs for inventory control, customer registration, accounting. The first months were chaotic. The system crashed constantly, we lost data. The older employees resisted the change. I came to bitterly regret the investment. But then, gradually, things started to work. The processes became more efficient, the control more precise. In a year, we had recovered the investment with the reduction of waste and the increase in productivity. Samuel didn't stop there. After finishing high school, he got a scholarship to study computer science in California. Another child leaving home, another painful separation for me, but necessary for his growth. "I'm going to create a system to interconnect the two stores, Mom," he promised at his farewell. "You will be able to see what's happening in Louisville without leaving here." At the time, it seemed like science fiction. Today, with the internet and cell phones, it seems obvious. But in 1985, the idea of stores interconnected by computers was revolutionary for a business of our size. Amid these professional changes, our family life was also transforming. Anthony got married in 1986 to Marianne, an architect he met during college. The ceremony was in the main church of our town, the same where I had married Richard so many years before. But the feelings were so different. While my marriage had been arranged, full of traditional expectations and little true love, Anthony's was based on mutual respect, admiration, partnership. Of course, I made Marianne's wedding dress. I worked on it for months, putting all my love and experience into every stitch. I wanted it to be perfect, not just because she was my daughter-in-law, but because I saw in that marriage the fulfillment of a dream that I myself never could fully live. A union based on conscious choice, not social conventions. The reception was in the parish hall, simple but elegant. During the party, amid the music and congratulations, I had a moment of deep reflection. Looking at my son and his bride dancing, at Claire animatedly talking with the guests, at Samuel adjusting the sound with his technical skill, I felt an immense gratitude for life. Despite all the difficulties, all the betrayals and disappointments, we had built something beautiful, something true. It was at this party, by the way, that I re-encountered Gerald, a widower who had recently moved to our town. He was the father of one of the seamstresses at the store, a gentleman with an easy smile and pleasant conversation. We danced one song, talked about gardening, a passion we discovered we shared, and exchanged impressions about life as a single parent. I didn't imagine that night that casual encounter would start a friendship that would slowly transform into something more. At 49 years old, I had grown accustomed to the idea of living alone, that my romantic story had ended with Richard's departure. But life, as always, had other plans. Gerald began to appear at the store more frequently, always with some excuse. Bringing something for his daughter, asking about an order, seeking advice about a gift. Gradually, our meetings extended to coffees after work, walks in the city park on Sundays, dinners where we talked for hours about books, films, travels we would like to take. It was strange, at almost 50, to feel those butterflies in my stomach, that expectation before a meeting, that joy at hearing someone's voice. My children noticed before I even admitted it to myself. "Mom, you're different," Claire commented during one of her visits from the capital. "Lighter, more smiley." "It's just the satisfaction of seeing you all well on your way," I deflected. She murmured, with that smile of someone who knows more than they say. "Could it have nothing to do with a certain gray-haired gentleman who doesn't stop calling the store?" I blushed like a teenager and changed the subject. But the truth is, Claire was right. Something was being born, something unexpected and beautiful. A second chance I never thought I deserved or desired. The marriage proposal came in 1988 during a picnic on the banks of the river that ran through town. Nothing grand or spectacular, just two mature people who had lived enough to know what they wanted, deciding to share the rest of their journeys. "I don't need a paper or a ceremony, Gerald," I said when he showed me the simple but elegant ring. "At my age, these conventions seem unnecessary." "It's not for the convention, Margaret," he replied with that calmness that always centered me. "It's because I want to celebrate with the world the luck I had in finding you, and because you deserve to be courted, celebrated, valued as the extraordinary woman you are." I married for the second time in an intimate ceremony, only with family members and close friends. Claire designed my dress, not white, but a shade of blue that matched my eyes, and my seamstresses made it with the same care they dedicated to the dresses of young brides. Anthony walked me down the aisle. Samuel was the best man, and Edward, who was already an integral part of our family, came specially from New York for the occasion. This marriage was so different from the first. There were no family expectations to fulfill, no social pressures, no naivete. It was a conscious choice of two people who had learned, through the pains and joys of life, the value of genuine companionship, of mutual respect, of honesty. Gerald and I didn't have children together, obviously, given our age, but we united our families. His 2 children, my 3, including Edward, whom Gerald welcomed without reservations, understanding the complexity of our family history. In the following years came the grandchildren. First Anthony's twins in 1989, then Claire's daughter in 1992, followed by 3 more grandchildren until the end of the decade. The arrival of the grandchildren brought a new dimension to my life. It was like reliving motherhood, but without the anxieties and financial difficulties of the first time. I could simply enjoy those children, teach them what life had taught me, tell them stories about their origins. And it was precisely telling stories to my grandchildren that the past came back to visit me in an unexpected way. One afternoon in 1994, my oldest granddaughter, Lucy, then 5 years old, found the watch box while playing in my room. "Grandma, what a beautiful box." "What's inside?" I hesitated for a moment. That watch held so many memories, so many pains, so many revelations. For an instant, I considered inventing a simple story, suitable for a child. But then, I remembered how lies, even the most well-intentioned ones, can grow and become uncontrollable monsters. It's a very old watch, dear. It belonged to your grandfather. Can I see? I opened the box and showed her the watch. Her little eyes shone with the beauty of the object. Is it gold, Grandma? No, it's just gilded, but it's very special anyway. Why? Ah, childish curiosity, so direct, so honest. How to explain to a child that that object had changed the course of my life, that its secret compartment had revealed a painful but liberating truth? Because this watch taught me one of the most important lessons in life, Lucy. What lesson, Grandma? That sometimes we need to look beyond the surface of things to find the truth, and that the truth, even when it hurts, is always better than the most beautiful of lies. She didn't fully understand, of course. She was too young, but she felt it, with that seriousness that children assume when they feel they are in the presence of something important. Can I have it when I grow up, Grandma? The question caught me by surprise. I had never thought about the fate of that watch after my departure. For so long, it had been a personal symbol, a reminder of my journey. Maybe, dear, when the right time comes. For now, it stays here with our stories and memories. That night, I told Gerald about the episode. He, who knew my whole story, who had patiently listened to every detail about Richard, Helen, the watch, and its secret compartment, took my hands in his. You know what impresses me about you, Margaret? Your capacity to transform pain into wisdom, betrayal into strength. Many people would have allowed themselves to become bitter, would have closed themselves off to life. You chose to move forward, to build something new, to embrace even the son of the other woman as if he were yours. I had no choice, Gerald. I had 3 children to raise. We always have a choice, my love. You could have chosen the path of resentment, of bitterness. Instead, you chose forgiveness, not for Richard, but for yourself. And that made all the difference. His words touched something deep in me. I had never thought that forgiving Richard was something I did for myself, not for him. But Gerald was right. Forgiveness didn't change the past, didn't erase the lies or betrayals, but it freed my future, allowed me to move forward without the weight of hatred or resentment. Perhaps that had been the true revelation of the watch. Not just the secret it kept in its hidden compartment, but the lesson it taught me about life, about relationships, about truths and lies. A lesson that now, at 79, looking back at all the path traveled, I see as the foundation upon which I built the second half of my existence. An existence that, despite all its difficulties, I consider full and blessed. Not by the absence of pains, for what life doesn't have them, but by the presence of true love, of honest achievements, of relationships based on truth and mutual respect. A life that, when it comes to an end, I will be able to say, I lived intensely, authentically, without hiding anything in secret compartments. If you ask me what is the greatest wealth of a long life like mine, I will say without hesitation. They are the stories we accumulate, the lessons we learn, and the chance to see time unfold its mysteries before our eyes. When I reached my 60s, in the early 2000s, I thought I had already lived everything life had in store for me. But time, always surprising, still had many pages to be written in my book. The turn of the millennium brought changes to the whole of society, and our family was no exception. That small atelier I started in the back of my sister's house had transformed into a respected chain of stores in Kentucky. Margaret's Creations had 5 units, the original in our town, 2 in Louisville, 1 in Lexington, and another recently inaugurated in Chicago, under Samuel's management, who had returned from abroad with new ideas. In 2002, at 65, I decided it was time to step away from the direct management of the stores. It wasn't an easy decision. That business had been my lifeline, my independence, my pride for more than 3 decades. But the body no longer had the same vigor, and the eyes that had given so many meticulous stitches in wedding dresses and baby layettes now tired quickly. Mom, you don't need to worry. Claire assured me when we communicated the decision to the family during a Sunday lunch. You built something solid with strong roots. Now it's our turn to make the tree continue growing. The tree metaphor moved me. I remembered when I planted a maple sapling in the yard of our first own house in 1975. It was just a thin branch, seeming too fragile to resist the first strong wind. Today, almost 50 years later, it's an imposing tree that colors the town with red every fall. So was my business, started in fragility, nourished with work and perseverance, now strong and vigorous in the hands of the new generation. Retirement opened space for other interests. Gerald, my companion for almost 15 years then, had retired from the carpentry workshop he managed, and together we began to explore passions that the working life had not allowed us. First came gardening, which we always loved. We transformed the yard of our house into a small paradise with carefully planned flower beds, an organic vegetable garden that supplied our kitchen, and fruit trees that attracted birds and butterflies. The afternoons, caring for the plants, feeling the earth in our hands, observing nature following its course, brought a peace I didn't know I needed. Then, encouraged by a group of friends of the same age, we began to travel. Nothing too extravagant. We weren't rich, just comfortably established, thanks to the business and the cautious management of our savings over the years. We started with trips across the United States, the beaches of Florida, the mountains of Colorado, the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Each place taught us something new, showed us a different facet of this country, immense and diverse, that despite having lived in it all our lives, we knew so little about. In 2005, at 68, I realized an old dream, to know Europe. Gerald and I saved for 2 years for that trip. We visited England, France, Spain, and Italy in an unforgettable month. For me, who grew up in a small town in rural Kentucky in the 1940s and 1950s, when traveling to the state capital was already an extraordinary adventure, being in Paris, Rome, Madrid was almost surreal. I vividly remember a particular moment in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. Gerald and I were sitting on a bench, observing the people, the architecture, the grandeur of that place. Suddenly, I was overcome by an overwhelming emotion, thinking about the path that life had traced for me. "What is it, my dear?" Gerald asked, noticing the tears that ran down my face. "I'm thinking about how life is incredible, Gerald. Who would have thought that I, a girl from rural Kentucky, raised to be just a wife and mother, would one day be here on the other side of the ocean, living this experience? If someone had told me this when I was 17, marrying Richard by family arrangement, I would have thought it impossible." He squeezed my hand, understanding the weight of those words. Gerald always had that ability to understand my deepest emotions, sometimes even before I understood them. "That's what I admire about you, Margaret. Life gave you bitter lemons, and you not only made lemonade, but created a whole plantation of lemon trees." We laughed together at the exaggerated metaphor, but there was a truth there that resonated in me. Each choice I made, after discovering the secret of the watch, each decision to move forward, not to let myself be defined by betrayal, to build something new, had brought me to that moment, that bench in Rome, that full life I now lived. Upon returning from that trip, I brought with me not just souvenirs and photographs, but a renewed perspective about the world and my place in it. I decided it was time to share more of my story, to transform my experiences into something that could help other people. I began in a simple way, participating in a support group for women victims of domestic violence in our town. Not that my story with Richard involved physical violence, that was never the case, but betrayal, lies, abandonment also leave deep scars on the soul. And my journey of overcoming, of reconstruction, resonated with those women who sought strength to restart. It was strange at almost 70 to speak openly about such old wounds. For decades, I had kept parts of my story guarded, shared only with family and closest friends. But there was something liberating about using my past pains to illuminate the path of other people. In one of these meetings, I met Carmen, a social worker who coordinated projects for women in vulnerable situations. She invited me to give a talk about female entrepreneurship at the community center. The idea terrified me. "I'm not a speaker, Carmen," I protested. "I've never spoken in public in my life." "But you have a powerful story, Margaret," she insisted, "and practical experience that no university professor can offer. These women need to see someone like them, who started from scratch, faced adversities, and won." I reluctantly accepted. I spent weeks preparing what I would say, rehearsing for Gerald, who patiently listened to me repeat the same stories, suggesting adjustments, encouraging me when nervousness threatened to make me give up. The day of the talk arrived. The community center was full, not just with women from the project, but also young entrepreneurs, students, curious ones. I trembled as I went up on the small improvised stage. But then I took a deep breath, looked at those expectant faces, and began to tell my story. I talked about the young Margaret, married at 17, a mother at 18, dedicated exclusively to the home and family. I talked about the painful discovery of the secret kept in the pocket watch, Richard's double life, the decision to confront him, the choice he made when leaving. I talked about the difficult years as a single mother, the closed doors, the prejudice, the nights of silent crying so as not to wake the children. And I talked about the sewing atelier, the first orders, the gradual expansion, the challenges of managing a growing business, the joys of seeing my children following their own paths. When I finished, I realized there were tears in many faces, not just of sadness for the shared pain, but of hope for the example of overcoming. The questions came in a cascade. The interest was genuine. The connection established was deep and true. That first talk led to others. Soon I was being invited to events in neighboring towns, to programs on the local radio, to interviews in regional newspapers. At 71, I discovered a new vocation, that of storyteller, of inspirer, of mentor. In 2008, at the invitation of Samuel, who in addition to managing the Chicago store, had become a university professor of entrepreneurship, I gave a talk to his students at the college. It was a surreal experience. Me, who barely completed elementary school, speaking to university students, sharing knowledge that no academic book could offer. "Mom, you are a success case," Samuel told me after the talk, using that modern terminology that I never got used to. "The students are fascinated by your trajectory. You should write a book." The suggestion seemed absurd to me at the moment. Write a book? Me, who grew up in an era when girls learned to embroider and cook, not to express ideas in writing? But the seed was planted and began to germinate silently. In 2010, at 73, I began to put my memories on paper. It wasn't easy. The words didn't always flow as I would like. The organization of ideas sometimes got jumbled. Emotions resurfaced intensely when revisiting certain episodes, but I persisted. Gerald was my first reader, my informal editor, my biggest encourager. The book, The Pocket Watch: Memories of a Reinvented Life, was published independently in 2012, with the financial support of my children. I didn't expect much repercussion. It was more of a personal project, a legacy for my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. To my surprise, the book found its audience. It started circulating in reading groups in the region, then in community libraries, and eventually attracted the attention of a medium-sized publisher that proposed a reissue with national distribution. Seeing my name on the cover of a book on bookstore shelves was an emotion I never imagined experiencing. The letters and emails, these Samuel helped me read, that I received from readers across the country, women who identified with different aspects of my story, who found inspiration in my journey, confirmed that sharing our experiences, even the painful ones, can be a powerful form of human connection. Amid all this activity, our family continued to grow and transform. Anthony and Marianne celebrated 25 years of marriage in 2011 with a moving vow renewal ceremony. Claire, after a difficult divorce, found a new love at 50 and started over, proving that second chances have no age. Samuel finally settled down after years dedicated exclusively to his career, marrying Paul, his companion of a decade, when same-sex marriage was legalized in Kentucky. Edward, Richard's son with Helen, who became an integral part of our family, now a university professor in New York, visited me regularly with his wife and children. The connection between us was always special, a bond forged not by blood, but by the conscious choice to transform a painful story into a relationship of genuine affection. The grandchildren, already teenagers and young adults, brought the energy of youth to our family gatherings. And in 2013 came the first great-granddaughter, Mary Claire, daughter of my granddaughter Lucy. Holding that small bundle in my arms, observing her delicate features, feeling her warmth, it was like closing a circle. 4 generations of women, each carrying a bit of the previous ones, each opening new paths. It was at this time that the pocket watch, kept for so many years, came back to occupy a central place in my life. Lucy, now a mother, remembered the promise I made when she was a child. "Grandma, remember when you showed me the watch? You said that one day, when I was an adult, I might have it. I think I now understand the true value of that object." I was surprised she remembered that conversation from so many years ago. But Lucy was always observant, sensitive to the nuances of family relationships, interested in the stories that underpinned our existence. "The watch isn't just a valuable antique," she continued. "It's a symbol of your journey, of our family history. I read your book, I heard your talks. Now I understand how much that object changed the course of your life, and by extension, my own existence." I brought the carved mahogany box from my room. Time had darkened the wood, softened the contours of the carvings, but it was still beautiful in its elegant simplicity. I opened it carefully. The watch, regularly maintained over the years, still worked perfectly. "You know," I said to Lucy, as I turned the watch between my fingers, "for a long time, this object represented to me the pain of betrayal, the rupture of a life I believed was secure. Then it became a symbol of my capacity for survival, for reconstruction. Today, I look at it and see mainly beauty, the beauty of things that, despite being imperfect, have history, have depth." I showed Lucy the small side button that opened the secret compartment. She pressed it carefully, revealing the space where the photograph of Helen and Edward was once hidden. "It's empty," she observed. "Yes," I replied. "Many years ago, after Edward became part of our family, there was no longer a need to keep secrets. The compartment is empty, but the lesson it taught me remains, that truth, however painful it may be, is always the path to freedom." I placed the watch in her hands. Lucy received it with reverence, understanding its symbolic value. "It's not just an object that I'm giving you, Lucy. It's a story, a journey, a reminder. When you look at this watch, remember that our lives rarely follow the path we plan, but it's in the unexpected curves that we often find our true strength." She nodded with tears in her eyes. At that moment, I felt that a significant part of my mission in this world was fulfilled. Not just to have children, create a business, write a book, but to transmit values, share wisdom, connect generations through the stories we live. The following years brought both joys and farewells, as is natural in the autumn of life. Gerald, my companion for almost 3 decades, passed away in 2015 after a brief battle with cancer. His departure left an immense void, but also a profound gratitude for the shared years, the genuine love we built, and the partnership that sustained us through life's challenges. Now, at 79 years old, I look back with serenity. The girl I was, the young betrayed wife, the single mother struggling to survive, the determined entrepreneur, the loving grandmother, the late blooming writer, all these Margarets are part of who I am today. Each experience, each choice, each challenge contributed to shaping the woman sitting here, sharing her story with you. The pocket watch that once held a devastating secret now marks different hours, hours of acceptance, understanding, and gratitude for life in all its complexities. It taught me that time, this mystery we try to measure with hands and gears, is actually a wise teacher that, if we allow it, guides us through darkness until we find our own light. And it was that light, my dear viewers, that illuminated my path to this point, and that I hope, through my stories, might also illuminate a bit of the path for each of you. If you ask me what is the greatest wealth of a long life like mine, I'll say without hesitation, it's the stories we accumulate, the lessons we learn, and the chance to see time unfold its mysteries before our eyes. Thank you so much for listening to me until now. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear that even in the most difficult situations, there is always hope, always a possible new beginning. A big hug to all of you, wherever you may be watching from. Until next time.